In the mountains of Bosnia, where morning mist clings to ancient forests like the ghosts of the past, there lived a woman whose life would be forever changed by a single sunrise. Maria Kovac had never held a weapon before the war came to her village. She was a schoolteacher who loved poetry and tended to her grandmother's garden every evening after classes. But on one terrible morning, as smoke rose from the ashes of everything she had ever called home, she would pick up a rifle and become something she never imagined possible. This is not a story of heroes and villains. This is not a tale of good versus evil. This is the raw, unfiltered truth of what happens when an ordinary woman is pushed beyond every limit she thought she had. When they burned her house, killed her family, and destroyed her entire world, Maria discovered that survival sometimes requires becoming someone you never wanted to be. What happened at sunrise that day would echo through the valleys for years to come. One woman. One shot. One moment that changed everything. This is her story. Maria Kovac woke every morning at 5:30, just as her grandmother had taught her. The routine was sacred in their small village of Srebrenica, nestled in the green hills of eastern Bosnia. She would make coffee in the old copper pot, feed the chickens in the backyard, and prepare lessons for the 23 children who filled her classroom with laughter and questions about the world beyond their mountain valley. The year was 1992, and while the news on the radio spoke of tensions rising across Yugoslavia, life in Srebrenica felt untouched by the political storms brewing in distant capitals. Maria's greatest concern was whether young Petar would finally learn his multiplication tables, and if the roof above the schoolhouse would survive another winter without major repairs. At 28, Maria had never married, much to the gentle concern of the village women who gathered each evening around the central fountain. She lived with her grandmother, Nana Milica, in a stone house that had sheltered 4 generations of their family. The house sat on a small hill overlooking the village center, with windows that caught the morning light and a garden where Nana grew the finest tomatoes in 3 counties. Maria's father had died when she was 12, in an accident at the local mine. Her mother had remarried and moved to Sarajevo, leaving Maria to be raised by Nana Milica, who filled the girl's head with stories of their ancestors and taught her that education was the only true inheritance she could ever give her.
Every afternoon after school, Maria would walk through the village, greeting neighbors by name.
She knew every family's story, every child's dreams, every grandmother's remedy for winter coughs. Petrovich always saved her the ripest apples. Old Jovan would stop his wood chopping to share the latest gossip from the neighboring villages. The baker's wife would slip an extra piece of bread into Maria's daily purchase, knowing that Nana's pension was small. This was Maria's world, small but complete, where everyone mattered and no one was forgotten. The first signs of trouble came not as dramatic news bulletins, but as whispered conversations that stopped when she approached. Families began leaving quietly in the night, loading their possessions into cars and driving toward the main road that led to Tuzla, or Sarajevo. When Maria asked her neighbor, Mr. Hadjic, why the Markovic family had suddenly departed, he looked away and mumbled something about visiting relatives. Nana Milica, who had lived through both world wars, watched these departures with growing unease. She began hiding extra food in the cellar and speaking in worried tones about patterns she recognized from her youth. But Maria, busy with her students and her lessons, chose to believe that whatever political troubles existed in other parts of the country would pass by their peaceful village, like storms that raged in distant valleys. The children in her classroom came from all the different communities that made Srebrenica their home. There were Bosnian Muslim children, like Amira and Kamal, Serbian Orthodox children, like Stefan and Milena, and Catholic Croat children like Anna and Marko. They played together, shared lunches, and helped each other with homework without any thought to the religious and ethnic labels that adults used to categorize them. Maria taught them literature and mathematics, but more importantly, she taught them to think critically and to question the world around them. She encouraged them to read books from different cultures, and to dream of universities and to careers that would take them far beyond the mountains. She believed deeply that education could bridge any divide and that knowledge was the antidote to the ignorance that bred hatred. In the evenings, Maria would sit with Nana Milica on their front porch, watching the sunset paint the sky orange and pink above the forested hills. Nana would tell stories of the old days, when the village had been even smaller and everyone had depended on each other for survival through harsh winters and difficult harvests. She spoke of neighbors who had helped each other regardless of their backgrounds, of mixed marriages that had strengthened community bonds, and of festivals where the whole village would gather to celebrate together. These evening conversations were Maria's favorite part of each day. Nana's voice carried the wisdom of 8 decades, and her stories painted pictures of a world where people were judged by their character rather than their names or the churches they attended. The old woman often worried aloud about the angry voices on the radio and the way politicians were dividing people into categories that had never mattered in their village. Maria's best friend was Dragana, a Serbian woman her age who worked as a nurse at the small medical clinic. They had grown up together, sharing secrets and dreams through childhood and adolescence. Dragana was engaged to Milan, a quiet man who worked for the postal service and wrote poetry in his spare time. The three of them would often spend weekends hiking in the mountains or sitting by the river that wound through the valley below the village. Neither Maria nor Dragana paid much attention to the political discussions that increasingly dominated adult conversations. They were more concerned with their work, their families, and their hopes for the future. Dragana wanted to specialize in pediatric nursing and perhaps move to a larger city where she could work in a modern hospital. Maria dreamed of pursuing a master's degree in education and returning to implement new teaching methods that would better prepare her students for the changing world. The local cafe, where men gathered each morning to drink coffee and debate everything from football to farming techniques, gradually became a place where political arguments grew louder and more heated. Maria noticed that some of her former students' fathers stopped greeting her warmly, and conversations that had once been friendly became stilted and formal. She also noticed changes in her classroom. Parents who had once encouraged their children to play with classmates from different backgrounds began asking questions about who their children sat next to and what stories Maria was choosing to read aloud. Some parents requested that their children be moved to different seats, away from children whose surnames suggested different ethnic origins. These requests confused and saddened Maria, but she refused to segregate her students. She believed that children learned best when they were exposed to different perspectives and that friendship knew no boundaries. She continued to assign mixed groups for projects and encouraged all her students to share stories from their family traditions during cultural appreciation days. The school principal, Mr. Nikolic, called Maria into his office one afternoon in early spring to discuss concerns that had been raised by some parents. He was an older man who had dedicated his life to education and had always supported Maria's innovative teaching methods. But now he looked tired and worried as he explained that political pressures from outside the village were beginning to affect the school. Some officials from the regional education ministry had visited the week before, asking questions about the curriculum and the way students from different backgrounds were being taught together. But they had made suggestions about separating children along ethnic lines and teaching different versions of history to different groups. Nikolic had politely declined these suggestions, but he warned Maria that such pressures were likely to increase. Maria left that meeting feeling troubled, but determined to continue teaching the way she believed was right. She would not allow outside forces to divide her students or corrupt the safe, nurturing environment she had worked so hard to create in her classroom. She decided to focus even more intentionally on lessons that emphasized shared human experiences and common values. That evening, she sat with Nana Milica and shared her concerns about the changes happening around them. The old woman listened carefully, nodding with the understanding that comes from having witnessed history's darker turns before. She reminded Maria that their family had always chosen to stand on the side of what was right, regardless of the personal cost. Nana told her granddaughter about an ancestor who had hidden Jewish families during the Second World War, risking her own life to protect neighbors who had nowhere else to turn. She spoke of Maria's grandfather, who had refused to participate in ethnic tensions that had briefly flared in the 1960s, instead choosing to help families from all backgrounds when they needed assistance. As spring progressed toward summer, the changes in the village became more pronounced. Families continued to leave, usually without explanation or farewell. The population of Maria's classroom dropped from 23 to 18, then to 15. Each empty desk felt like a small wound in the heart of the community she loved. Radio broadcasts became increasingly inflammatory, with politicians and commentators using language that painted different ethnic groups as enemies. Neighbors who had lived peacefully together for generations began viewing each other with suspicion. Old friendships became strained as people were pressured to choose sides in conflicts they didn't understand or want any part of. Maria tried to maintain normalcy in her classroom and her daily routines, but the atmosphere in the village grew heavier with each passing week. Even the weather seemed to reflect the growing tension, with unseasonably violent thunderstorms that sent children running for shelter and left the adults muttering about bad omens. The last normal day of Maria's life was a Tuesday in late June. She taught her remaining students about poetry, helping them understand how words could paint pictures and express emotions that were too complex for ordinary conversation. Young Amira wrote a poem about her grandmother's hands, describing how they kneaded bread and braided hair with equal tenderness. Stefan composed verses about the mountain streams where he loved to fish with his father. After school, Maria walked through the village as usual, but noticed that fewer people were outside working in their gardens or chatting with neighbors. The cafe was nearly empty except for a few old men playing chess in silence. Even the children seemed subdued, staying closer to their homes instead of running freely through the streets as they had always done. That evening, Maria and Nana Milica sat on their porch, watching storm clouds gather above the mountains. The air felt heavy and electric, charged with the kind of energy that comes before nature unleashes its fury. Neither woman spoke much, but both seemed to sense that their peaceful world was balanced on the edge of something terrible. As darkness fell, they went inside and prepared for bed, following the same routines that had structured their lives for so many years. Nana Milica checked the locks on the doors and windows, something she had never done before but now felt compelled to do. Maria prepared her lessons for the next day, choosing a story about friendship and cooperation to share with her students. Neither of them could have imagined that by the next sunset, everything they had ever known and loved would be reduced to ashes, and Maria would be forced to become someone she never thought she could be. The last night of innocence passed quietly in their stone house on the hill, while forces beyond their control moved through the darkness toward their village.
The woman who went to sleep that night was a teacher, a granddaughter, a friend, and a believer in the fundamental goodness of human nature. The woman who would emerge from the nightmare ahead would be someone entirely different, forged by loss and hardened by the terrible knowledge that sometimes survival requires abandoning everything you once believed about yourself and the world.
The sound that woke Maria was not the gentle chiming of her grandmother's old clock or the familiar crow of the rooster in their backyard. It was the deep, mechanical rumble of trucks moving through the village in the pre-dawn darkness, accompanied by voices speaking in sharp, commanding tones that carried through the still air like threats. She sat up in bed, her heart immediately racing with a primal fear she didn't yet understand. Through her bedroom window, she could see lights moving through the village below. Not the warm glow of neighbors starting their morning routines, but the harsh white beams of searchlights cutting through the darkness like swords. From the next room, she heard Nana Milica's voice, low and urgent, calling her name. Maria pulled on her clothes quickly and ran to her grandmother, who was standing at the front window, her face pale in the strange light filtering through the curtains. The old woman's hands were trembling as she pointed toward the village center. Below them, military vehicles were positioned at key intersections, and soldiers in uniforms Maria didn't recognize were moving from house to house in organized groups. Even from a distance, she could see that they were armed and moving with the efficiency of men following orders rather than the casual movements of people conducting ordinary business. Nana Milica grabbed her granddaughter's arm with surprising strength. Her voice was barely a whisper, but carried the weight of terrible understanding. She told Maria to listen carefully and do exactly as she said. They needed to take only what they could carry and hide in the old cellar beneath the house, the one that had been dug during the last war and had served as shelter during bombing raids 60 years earlier. As Maria gathered a few belongings, the sounds from the village grew louder and more ominous. She could hear vehicles stopping, doors slamming, and men shouting orders in voices that seemed designed to intimidate and control. There were other sounds, too. Sounds that made her blood run cold. The splintering of wood as doors were broken down, the crash of furniture being overturned, and underneath it all, the voices of her neighbors, raised in fear and confusion. The cellar beneath their house was small and damp, carved from the rocky hillside by Maria's great-grandfather when fascist forces had threatened the region decades earlier. Nana Milica had stored emergency supplies there over the years, almost as if she had always known this day might come. There were candles, bottles of water, canned food, and blankets that smelled of mothballs and old memories. They huddled together in the darkness, listening to the nightmare unfolding above them. The sounds grew closer as the organized sweep of the village moved up the hill toward their section of houses. Maria could hear individual voices now, neighbors she had known all her life crying out in terror and pleading in tones that suggested they were begging for their lives. Mrs. Petrovich, who had always saved the best apples for Maria, was screaming for someone to leave her grandchildren alone. The sound of her anguish cut through Maria like a knife, and she started to rise, instinctively wanting to help, but Nana Milica pulled her back down with strength born of desperation. The old woman whispered harshly in her ear, explaining what Maria was too innocent to understand. These were not soldiers coming to protect them or maintain order. These were paramilitaries, men who had been given weapons and permission to drive certain people from their homes by any means necessary. And they were targeting families based on their surnames, their religion, their ethnicity, turning neighbors into enemies. and homes into battlegrounds. Through the floorboards above their heads, they heard heavy boots entering their house. The soldiers moved through their rooms with brutal efficiency, overturning furniture, smashing dishes, and searching for anything of value or anything that might indicate the political loyalties of the residents. Maria heard her books being thrown across the floor, the sound of pages tearing and bindings breaking as soldiers destroyed the library she had spent years building. They found Nana Militsa's photographs, the carefully preserved images of family members spanning 4 generations. Maria could hear the glass breaking as frames were smashed against the walls, erasing the faces of ancestors who had lived and loved and died in this house. The sound of destruction was methodical and thorough, as if the soldiers were trying to erase not just the people but the very memory of their existence. When the soldiers finally left their house and moved on to the next target, Maria and Nana Militsa remained hidden in the cellar, afraid to emerge even though the immediate danger had passed. The sounds of destruction continued throughout the village as the operation moved from house to house, family to family, systematically dismantling the community that had taken generations to build. As dawn approached, a new horror began. The smell of smoke drifted down into their hiding place, acrid and sharp, carrying with it the chemical odor of burning plastic and the sickly sweet smell of burning wood. The soldiers were not content merely to drive people from their homes. They were burning those homes to ensure there would be nothing to return to. Through the small window that looked out at ground level from the cellar, Maria could see an orange glow growing brighter against the morning sky. The systematic destruction of her village had moved into a new phase, and the men with weapons were making certain that their work would be permanent and irreversible. Nana Militsa began to pray quietly, reciting words that had comforted her through previous wars and tragedies. But her prayers were interrupted by sounds that suggested the soldiers had returned to their house. There were voices above them, and the smell of smoke grew suddenly stronger. The realization hit them both at the same moment. The house above them was burning and they were trapped beneath it in a cellar that could become their tomb. They had to choose between the certain death of remaining hidden and the probable death of emerging into a world where armed men were systematically destroying everyone and everything they had ever known. Nana Militsa made the decision for both of them.
I was just a...
She pushed open the cellar door and led Maria up the narrow steps into their kitchen, now thick with smoke and illuminated by the orange glow of flames that were already consuming the front rooms of the house. The heat was intense, and the smoke burned their eyes and throats as they stumbled toward the back door. They emerged into their garden, where the tomato plants Nana had tended so carefully were already wilting in the heat from the burning house. The soldiers had done their work efficiently. The old stone house that had sheltered Maria's family for nearly a century was burning fiercely, sending sparks into the morning sky like prayers that would never be answered. But Maria's attention was not focused on the burning home. It was fixed on the scene that greeted them in their backyard, a sight so horrible that her mind initially refused to process what her eyes were showing her. Nana Militsa lay crumpled near the garden gate, her body twisted in a position that spoke of violence and terror. Blood pooled around her gray hair, dark against the earth where she had grown her vegetables and flowers. Her eyes stared sightlessly at the sky she had watched every evening from their porch, and her hands, which had braided Maria's hair and kneaded bread and told stories through gentle touches, were still and cold. The scream that erupted from Maria's throat was primitive and raw, a sound of grief and rage that seemed to tear from the deepest part of her soul. She dropped to her knees beside her grandmother's body, her hands hovering over the wounds, afraid to touch but unable to accept the reality of what she was seeing. Nana Militsa had not died peacefully in her sleep after a long and fulfilling life surrounded by people who loved her. She had died in terror and pain, murdered by strangers, who had decided that her very existence was a threat to their vision of the future. The woman who had taught Maria about kindness and forgiveness had been shown neither in her final moments. Maria knelt in the growing heat from the burning house, holding her grandmother's cooling hand, while around her the village that had been her entire world continued to burn. Every house on their hill was now engulfed in flames, and the morning air was filled with smoke and the distant sounds of vehicles moving on to the next target, the next community to be erased. She stayed beside Nana Militsa's body until the heat from the fire became unbearable and she was forced to retreat toward the edge of their property. From there, she could see the full scope of the devastation that had been visited upon her home. The village that had awakened her each morning with the sounds of normal life was now a collection of burning buildings and empty streets. There were no neighbors emerging from their homes to help fight the fires or comfort each other. There were no children playing in the streets or elderly people tending their gardens. The heart of the community had been ripped out in a single night, leaving behind only destruction and silence. As the sun rose fully above the mountains, casting harsh light on the smoking ruins below,
Maria realized that she was completely alone in the world for the first time in her life. Everyone she had ever loved was either dead or had fled in terror during the night. The place where she had planned to spend her entire life teaching children and caring for her family no longer existed. The woman who had gone to sleep as a teacher and granddaughter was now something else entirely, a refugee, a survivor, an orphan in her own homeland. She had no home, no family, no community, and no understanding of where she could go or what she could do in this new reality that had been imposed upon her through violence. But even as she stood there in shock and grief, watching everything she had ever known burn to ashes, a different kind of fire was beginning to ignite within her. It was not the destructive fire that was consuming her village, but something harder and colder, forged from loss and hardened by rage. Maria looked down at her grandmother's body one last time, memorizing the face that had been the source of so much love and wisdom in her life. She made a promise to Nana Melissa's still form, words spoken in a voice she didn't recognize as her own. She would not forget. She would not forget. And somehow, in some way, she would make certain that those responsible for this atrocity would face consequences for what they had done. The schoolteacher who had believed in the fundamental goodness of human nature was dying in the smoke and flames of that terrible morning. Someone else was being born from her ashes, someone harder and more dangerous. Someone who would learn that survival sometimes requires abandoning every principle you once held sacred. The transformation had begun, though Maria didn't yet understand where it would lead her or what she would become. She only knew that the world had shown her its true face, and now she would have to decide what kind of face she would show the world in return. Maria buried her grandmother with her bare hands in the small cemetery behind the old church, the same church where Nana Milica had been baptized 86 years earlier. The ground was hard and rocky, and her fingernails broke and bled as she clawed at the earth, but she refused to leave Nana's body for the animals or for the men who might return to complete their destruction. The other graves in the cemetery had been desecrated during the attack, headstones smashed and memorial flowers scattered like broken promises across the churned earth. But Maria found a quiet corner near an old oak tree where the ground was softer, and there she made a place for the woman who had raised her and taught her everything important about life. She had no coffin, no priest, no mourners to help her say goodbye. There were only her tears, her whispered promises of remembrance, and the sound of dirt falling on the blanket she had wrapped around Nana Milica's body. When the grave was finished, she marked it with a simple cross made from 2 pieces of charred wood from their burned house. As she knelt beside the fresh grave, Maria tried to pray, but the words that had once come easily to her lips now felt hollow and meaningless. What kind of God allowed innocent people to be murdered in their homes? What kind of divine plan included the systematic destruction of communities and the targeting of grandmothers who had never harmed anyone in their entire lives? The questions without answers echoed in her mind as she gathered what few possessions she could salvage from the ruins of her home. Her grandmother's recipe book had survived the fire, its pages singed but still readable. She found a photograph of her parents on their wedding day. The glass cracked, but their smiling faces still visible through the damage. Most importantly, she discovered that Nana Milica's hiding place in the cellar had protected more than just their lives during the attack. The old woman had hidden money there, enough to survive for several weeks, along with important documents and a small hunting rifle that had belonged to Maria's grandfather. Maria had never touched a weapon before, but as she held the rifle in her hands, she felt something shift inside her chest. The weight of it was substantial and reassuring, and for the first time since the attack, she felt like she might have some measure of control over what happened to her next. She left the ruins of her village as the sun set on the second day, walking into the forested mountains where she had once hiked for pleasure with her friend Dragana. But now she was not a teacher, enjoying a weekend in nature. She was a refugee seeking shelter in the only place that remained beyond the reach of the men with weapons who had redefined her world. The mountains of eastern Bosnia were vast and largely uninhabited, covered with dense forests of pine and oak that had provided sanctuary for generations of people fleeing from wars and persecution. Maria had heard stories from Nana Milica about relatives who had hidden in these same mountains during World War II, surviving for months on wild berries and stream water while fascist forces searched for them below. She found a cave halfway up a steep hillside, hidden behind a curtain of dense undergrowth and accessible only through a narrow passage that would be invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. The cave was small but dry, with a narrow opening that provided ventilation while remaining concealed from outside view. For the first few days, Maria simply existed in a state of shock and grief, curled up in the darkness of her hiding place like a wounded animal waiting to heal or die. She ate little and spoke to no one,
processing the magnitude of her loss and trying to understand how her entire life had been erased in a single night.
But gradually, survival instincts that she never knew she possessed began to assert themselves. She started venturing out of the cave during daylight hours to gather edible plants and berries, using knowledge that Nana Milica had passed down to her about which forest foods were safe and nourishing. She learned to move silently through the undergrowth, staying hidden from the patrols that occasionally moved through the valleys below. She discovered that the hunting rifle came with a box of ammunition that her grandfather had stored with it, and she began practicing with the weapon, learning to load and fire it accurately. At first, she told herself that she was simply learning to hunt for food, that the rifle was a tool for survival rather than a weapon of war. She shot rabbits and birds, teaching herself to skin and prepare them, building small, smokeless fires that would cook her food without revealing her location to anyone searching the mountains. But as the weeks passed and she grew stronger and more skilled in the ways of forest survival, Maria began to encounter other refugees who were hiding in the mountains. They were families who had fled their homes during similar attacks, individuals who had lost everything and everyone they cared about, children who had watched their parents murdered and their houses burned. Each story she heard was a variation on her own nightmare, tales of systematic violence designed to drive certain populations from their ancestral homes through terror and brutality. She learned that what had happened to her village was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger campaign of ethnic cleansing that was sweeping across the region. The refugees shared information about which areas were safe and which were controlled by hostile forces. They told her about concentration camps, where civilians were being held in conditions that echoed the darkest chapters of European history. They described mass graves being dug in remote locations, where the evidence of atrocities could be hidden from international observers. But most importantly, they told her about resistance groups that were forming in the mountains, collections of people who had decided that hiding was not enough, that survival meant fighting back against the forces that were trying to erase them from existence. Maria listened to these stories around carefully concealed campfires, watching the faces of people who had been transformed by loss into something harder and more dangerous than they had ever imagined they could become. She recognized her own reflection in their eyes, the look of innocence replaced by a cold understanding of what humans were capable of doing to each other. An old man named Dragan, who had been a professor of history at the university in Sarajevo before losing his wife and 3 children in a massacre, became something of a mentor to Maria. He had served in the Yugoslav People's Army during his youth and retained knowledge of military tactics and weapons that proved invaluable to the growing group of survivors who were beginning to organize themselves into something resembling a fighting force. Dragan taught Maria that the rifle she carried could be more than just a hunting tool. He showed her how to clean and maintain it properly, how to estimate distances and compensate for wind when taking long-range shots, and most importantly, how to remain calm and focused under pressure. More than technical skills, Dragan taught Maria about the psychology of warfare and resistance. He explained that their enemies were counting on them to remain passive victims, to hide in the mountains until they starved or froze or simply gave up hope. Fighting back was not just about survival. It was about refusing to accept the role of helpless prey that had been assigned to them. The group that formed around Dragan's leadership was unlike any military unit that had ever existed in the region. It included teachers and farmers, doctors and factory workers, grandmothers and teenagers. People who had never imagined themselves as soldiers, but who had been forced to choose between fighting and dying. They had little in common except their losses and their determination not to let those losses be meaningless. They came from different ethnic and religious backgrounds, but the violence that had driven them into the mountains had made such distinctions irrelevant. They were united by their shared humanity and their shared refusal to surrender. Maria threw herself into the training that Dragan provided with an intensity that surprised even her. She learned to move through the forest without making a sound, to read tracks and signs that would tell her who had passed through an area and when. She practiced shooting until she could hit targets at distances that seemed impossible, developing the kind of accuracy that came only through countless hours of focused practice. But more than technical skills, she was learning to think like a predator rather than prey. She studied the patrol patterns of enemy forces, learning their routines and identifying their weaknesses. She began to understand how small groups of highly motivated fighters could use knowledge of the terrain and superior marksmanship to disrupt larger, better-equipped military units. The first time she was asked to participate in an actual combat operation, Maria felt her stomach clench with a mixture of fear and anticipation. The target was a checkpoint that enemy forces had established on a mountain road, a position they were using to control movement through the area and to intercept refugees trying to escape to safer territory. Dragan had observed the checkpoint for several days and determined that it was usually manned by 3 soldiers who had grown careless and complacent in their duties. They took turns sleeping during their shifts, confident that no one would dare to challenge their position in this remote location. The plan was simple but required precise execution. Maria would position herself on a ridge overlooking the checkpoint, providing cover for 2 other fighters who would approach from different angles. If everything went according to plan, they would neutralize the guards silently and quickly, then destroy the checkpoint to prevent its continued use. As Maria climbed to her position in the pre-dawn darkness, carrying her grandfather's rifle and wearing clothing that would blend into the forest shadows, she felt as if she were climbing out of one life and into another. The woman who had once taught children about poetry and cooperation was about to become someone who solved problems with violence and bullets. She found her position as the first light of dawn began to illuminate the valley below. Through the scope of her rifle, she could see the checkpoint clearly, including the faces of the soldiers who were responsible for preventing people like her from escaping the nightmare that their homeland had become. For a moment, looking at those faces through her rifle scope, Maria hesitated. These were probably young men with families and dreams, people who might have been her neighbors in a different time and place. But then she remembered Nana Milica's broken body in their garden, and the sound of Mrs. Petrovich screaming for her grandchildren, and the sight of her village burning in the morning light. The world had taught her that mercy was a luxury that victims could not afford. If she was going to survive, if she was going to honor the memory of everyone she had lost, she had to become someone capable of making the hard choices that survival required. When Dragan gave the signal, Maria took her first shot as a resistance fighter, and the woman who had once believed in the fundamental goodness of human nature took another step away from the person she used to be. The bullet found its target with the precision that came from months of practice, and the checkpoint ceased to be a barrier for refugees trying to escape to freedom. That shot changed everything for Maria, not because it made her feel powerful, but because it made her feel nothing at all. The ability to take a human life without emotional turmoil was a skill she discovered she possessed, and like all dangerous skills, it was something that became easier with practice. The mountains had taught her to be a predator, and now she would use those lessons to teach her enemies what it meant to hunt someone who could hunt them back. Word of the female sniper in the eastern mountains spread through both military channels and refugee networks like wildfire in dry grass. The enemy forces called her the Ghost because she struck without warning and disappeared without trace, leaving behind only the evidence of her deadly accuracy and the growing fear among soldiers who had once felt invulnerable in their armored vehicles and fortified positions. The refugees called her the Angel because her interventions often created opportunities for families to escape through corridors that had previously been blocked by hostile forces. Children who made it to safety in distant countries would remember stories of a woman with a rifle who appeared when hope seemed lost, clearing paths through enemy lines with shots that seemed to come from nowhere. Maria had become legendary without ever seeking fame or recognition. She moved through the mountains like a force of nature, striking at targets of opportunity, and then melting back into the forest before anyone could respond. Her reputation grew with each successful operation, and enemy commanders began devoting significant resources to hunting her down. The rifle that had belonged to her grandfather had been replaced with a more sophisticated weapon taken from a fallen enemy sniper. The new rifle was equipped with a high-quality scope and could deliver accurate fire at ranges that extended far beyond what most soldiers could even see with the naked eye. In Maria's hands, it became an instrument of precision that could reach out and touch targets more than a kilometer away. But the weapon was only as effective as the person using it, and Maria had spent months learning not just how to shoot, but how to think like the prey she was hunting. She studied the habits and psychology of soldiers, understanding their routines, their fears, and their weaknesses. She learned to anticipate their movements and position herself where she could inflict maximum damage while remaining safely beyond their reach. Her success was not measured only in the number of enemy soldiers she eliminated, though that count had grown substantial over the months of her campaign. More importantly, her presence in the mountains had disrupted enemy operations throughout the region, forcing them to divert troops and resources to defensive measures that reduced their ability to conduct offensive operations against civilian populations. Every convoy that traveled through mountain passes now required additional security escorts. Every checkpoint had to be reinforced with extra guards and protected positions. Every patrol had to move with the constant awareness that death might be waiting for them from a ridge they couldn't see or a position they couldn't identify until it was too late. The psychological impact of her operations was as significant as the physical damage she inflicted. Soldiers began to report sick more frequently, reluctant to participate in patrols through areas where the Ghost was known to operate. Some units experienced disciplinary problems as men refused direct orders to advance through territories where they might become her next target. But Maria paid a price for every victory she achieved. The isolation of her lifestyle was wearing on her psyche in ways that she was only beginning to understand. She could go weeks without speaking to another human being, moving through the wilderness like a solitary predator that had lost all connection to the social bonds that once defined her existence. The woman who had once thrived on the laughter and questions of children now found human contact almost unbearable. When she occasionally encountered other resistance fighters or refugees, she felt awkward and disconnected, as if she had forgotten how to engage in normal human interaction. The skills that made her deadly in combat seemed to create barriers between her and everyone else who had not walked the same path she had traveled. Sleep had become elusive and restless, filled with dreams that were sometimes memories and sometimes visions of violence that her mind conjured from the darkness of her experiences. She would wake in her hidden camps with her rifle in her hands, ready to fire at threats that existed only in her subconscious mind. Food had lost most of its taste, becoming simply fuel to keep her body functioning rather than a source of pleasure or comfort. She ate what she could find or take from enemy supplies, but everything tasted like ash in her mouth, as if her capacity for simple pleasures had been burned away along with her village. The face that looked back at her from still pools of mountain water was barely recognizable as the woman who had once stood before a classroom full of children, teaching them about the beauty of literature and the importance of kindness. Her features had grown sharp and angular, hardened by constant vigilance and shaped by the kind of stress that ages people far beyond their years. But most troubling of all was the realization that she was losing her ability to remember who she had been before the war. The memories of her classroom, her students, her quiet evenings with Nana Miliska were fading, like photographs left too long in the sun. Sometimes she had to concentrate intensely, just to recall the sound of children's laughter or the taste of her grandmother's cooking. The woman she was becoming seemed to be consuming the woman she had been, and Maria wasn't certain that the transformation was entirely voluntary. She was adapting to survive in an environment that rewarded violence and punished mercy, but the adaptations were changing her in ways that might be irreversible. During one particularly difficult winter night, holed up in a cave while a blizzard raged outside, Maria found herself wondering if she was becoming the very thing she was fighting against. She was taking lives with cold efficiency, making calculations about human targets based on strategic value rather than their individual humanity. How different was she from the soldiers who had destroyed her village and murdered her grandmother? The question haunted her through the long winter months as she continued her campaign against enemy forces in the region. But every time she began to doubt the righteousness of her mission, she would encounter fresh evidence of atrocities being committed against civilian populations, and her resolve would harden once again. She discovered mass graves in remote valleys where hundreds of people had been executed and buried in unmarked pits. She found abandoned villages where the evidence of systematic murder and rape was written in blood on walls and burned into the memories of the few survivors who had managed to escape. She rescued children who had been separated from their families during ethnic cleansing operations, guiding them to safe passage routes while eliminating the guards who would have sent them to concentration camps. She provided cover for convoys of refugees who were trying to reach international borders, picking off the snipers who were shooting at women and children for sport. Each mission reinforced her understanding that this was not a war between soldiers, but a campaign of extermination directed against civilians whose only crime was belonging to the wrong ethnic or religious group. Her enemies were not honorable warriors fighting for legitimate military objectives. They were predators who had been given uniforms and weapons to legitimize their hunting of helpless prey. This realization allowed Maria to push aside whatever doubts she had about the moral implications of her actions. She was not a soldier in a conventional war. She was a defender of people who had no other protection against forces that sought to erase them from existence. Every shot she fired was a vote for the right of innocent people to continue living on the land where their ancestors had lived for centuries. Her reputation had grown to the point where enemy commanders were offering substantial rewards for information leading to her capture or death. Propaganda broadcasts described her as a terrorist and a war criminal, trying to turn local populations against her by portraying her as a threat to regional stability. But the people who lived in the mountains knew better. They had seen the bodies of children that enemy forces left behind when they swept through villages. They had witnessed the systematic destruction of communities that had existed peacefully for generations. They understood that the ghost in the mountains was not the source of their troubles, but one of the few forces standing between them and complete annihilation. Information about enemy movements flowed to Maria through networks of farmers and shepherds who considered themselves part of her intelligence operation even though they never met her directly. They would leave messages at predetermined locations describing patrol schedules and troop movements that allowed her to plan her operations with precision. Local women would sometimes leave food and supplies at drop points, ensuring that she could maintain her campaign without having to expose herself by entering populated areas. Children who had been saved by her interventions would grow up hearing stories about the woman with the rifle who appeared when evil threatened innocent people. The winter of her second year in the mountains was particularly harsh, with snowdrifts that made movement almost impossible and temperatures that threatened to kill anyone who lacked adequate shelter. Enemy forces reduced their patrol activity during the worst months, assuming that no one could survive in the mountains during such extreme conditions. They were wrong. Maria had learned to read the weather patterns and to find or create shelter that would protect her from the elements, while keeping her hidden from anyone who might be searching for her. She had cached supplies at locations throughout her operational area, ensuring that she could sustain herself even during the most difficult periods. When spring returned and enemy forces resumed their normal patrol patterns, they discovered that the Ghost had not only survived the winter but had used the time to prepare new positions and identify new targets. Her first operation of the new season was a masterpiece of planning and execution that demonstrated how much her skills had evolved during her months in the wilderness. An enemy commander who had been particularly brutal in his treatment of civilian populations was scheduled to inspect a forward observation post that his unit had established on a mountain peak. Intelligence sources had provided Maria with detailed information about his travel schedule and the security arrangements that would be in place during his visit. The observation post was positioned on a peak that enemy forces considered impregnable, surrounded by steep cliffs and accessible only by a single narrow path that was heavily guarded. They had calculated that no attacker could get close enough to threaten the position without being detected and eliminated by the guards. They had not calculated on an attacker who could deliver accurate fire from a range of nearly 2 kilometers, from a position so distant that the sound of the shot would not reach the target until long after the bullet had completed its work. Maria spent 3 days moving into position, traveling mostly at night and using routes that took her far around the enemy security perimeter. She carried minimal equipment to avoid being slowed down, but included everything she would need to make a single perfect shot at an extreme range. On the morning of the operation, she was in position before dawn, lying motionless on a ridge that enemy forces could not even see from their observation post. Through her scope, she could watch their routine activities, studying their movements and waiting for the moment when her primary target would present himself clearly enough for her to take the shot. When the enemy commander emerged from the fortified bunker to survey the valley below, he was confident in his security and comfortable in his power. He had never imagined that someone might be watching him through a scope from a mountain so distant that it appeared as merely another feature of the landscape. Maria controlled her breathing, calculated the effects of wind and elevation on her bullet's trajectory, and gently squeezed the trigger at the moment when all conditions were perfect.
No, why know what stream in its own nation passes.
The shot was the culmination of everything she had learned during her time in the mountains, a demonstration of skills that had been purchased with months of hardship and sacrifice. The bullet traveled for more than 3 seconds before finding its target, crossing a distance that would have challenged the most sophisticated military snipers in the world. When it struck, the enemy commander collapsed instantly, killed by a shot that seemed to come from the hand of God, rather than from any human shooter. The guards at the observation post spun in circles, trying to identify where the shot had come from, but Maria was already moving away from her firing position, disappearing into terrain that she knew better than they knew their own headquarters. By the time they organized a search, she was kilometers away, leaving behind only the evidence of what a single, perfectly placed bullet could accomplish. That shot would be her signature operation, the one that enemy commanders would remember when they tried to explain to their superiors how a single woman with a rifle was disrupting military operations across an entire region. It was the shot that would make her a legend among the people she was protecting, and a nightmare for the forces that were trying to destroy them. But for Maria, it was simply another step in a journey that was taking her farther and farther away from the woman she used to be, toward a destiny that she could not yet see but was moving toward with the inevitability of a bullet traveling toward its target. The intelligence report came through the refugee network on a cold March morning, carried by a shepherd boy who had witnessed something that made his hands shake as he delivered his message. The paramilitary unit that had destroyed Maria's village was returning to the area, planning to establish a permanent base in the ruins of her childhood home. The same men who had murdered Nana Milica and burned everything Maria had ever loved were coming back to claim the land they had stolen through violence and terror. They intended to build their headquarters on the ashes of the community they had erased, turning the place where children had once played and learned into a fortress from which they could launch new attacks against other innocent populations. Maria received this information while camped in a grove of pine trees 10 kilometers from what had once been Srebrenica. She had not returned to her village since that terrible morning when she had buried her grandmother and walked into the mountains to become someone else.
The thought of seeing those charred ruins again filled her with a mixture of grief and rage that threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained emotional control. But beneath the pain was something harder and more focused, an opportunity for the kind of justice that courts and international tribunals could never provide.
The men responsible for destroying her world were presenting themselves as targets, returning to the scene of their crimes with the arrogance of predators who believed themselves untouchable. Maria spent 2 days moving carefully through the valleys that led toward her former home, using routes she had traveled as a child but now seeing them through the eyes of a predator planning an attack. Every ridge and stream held memories of innocence, but those memories were now overlaid with tactical considerations about fields of fire and escape routes. The village looked exactly as she had left it 3 years earlier, a collection of blackened foundations and collapsed walls where homes had once stood. Weeds and small trees had begun to grow through the ruins, nature slowly reclaiming the destruction that humans had created. The cemetery where she had buried Nana Milica was overgrown with thorns, but the simple wooden cross still marked the spot where the most important person in her life rested. But now there was new construction amid the ruins, ugly concrete buildings that squatted among the destroyed houses like tumors growing in healthy tissue. The paramilitaries were building barracks, ammunition storage facilities, and a command center that would serve as the nerve center for their operations throughout the region. Through her scope, Maria could observe the daily routines of the soldiers who were establishing this base. She recognized some of their faces from that terrible morning, men who had aged and grown comfortable in their roles as professional killers. They moved with the casual confidence of people who had never faced serious consequences for their actions. The base was well designed from a defensive perspective, with overlapping fields of fire and multiple layers of security that would make a direct assault impossible for any conventional military unit. But Maria was not planning a conventional assault. She was planning something more personal and infinitely more precise. Her target was not the base itself, but the man who commanded it, Colonel Ratko Mladic, the officer who had personally ordered the destruction of her village and dozens of others throughout the region. Intelligence reports indicated that he would be conducting a formal inspection of the new facility at dawn on the anniversary of the original attack, a symbolic gesture designed to demonstrate the permanence of his forces' control over the territory they had conquered. The irony was not lost on Maria that this monster had chosen to celebrate his victory on the very day when she had lost everything that mattered to her. The timing felt like destiny, as if the universe was providing her with an opportunity to balance the scales of justice on the anniversary of her greatest loss. She spent days studying the layout of the base and the security arrangements that would be in place during the colonel's visit. The inspection would begin at sunrise when the colonel would emerge from the command center to review the troops assembled in the central courtyard. He would be exposed for approximately 30 seconds as he walked from the building to the reviewing platform, a window of opportunity that would require perfect timing and flawless execution. The challenge was finding a firing position that would provide a clear shot at the target while remaining beyond the range of the security forces that would be searching for threats. The base was positioned in the valley where her village had once stood, surrounded by hills that rose on 3 sides. Most of those hills were within the security perimeter that the paramilitaries had established around their facility. But there was one ridge, nearly 2 kilometers away, that the defenders had apparently deemed too distant to pose a threat.
It was the same ridge where Maria had gone sledding as a child, where she had picked wildflowers for her grandmother, where she had once sat with her best friend Dragana to watch sunsets and dream about their futures. Now that ridge would serve a darker purpose, becoming the platform from which she would deliver justice for all the innocent people who had died in the valley below.
The shot would be at the absolute limit of her rifle's effective range, complicated by wind patterns that swirled unpredictably around the mountain peaks and atmospheric conditions that could deflect her bullet by inches. Maria moved into position the night before the inspection, climbing to her firing point under cover of darkness and settling into a hide she had constructed from natural materials that would make her invisible to any observers in the valley below. She carried enough food and water to sustain her for 48 hours, in case the inspection was delayed or her escape from the area took longer than planned. As she lay in position through the long hours of the night, waiting for dawn and the opportunity she had been preparing for during 3 years in the mountains, Maria found her thoughts returning to the woman she had been before the war. She tried to remember what it felt like to believe in the goodness of human nature, to wake up each morning with optimism about the future, to see other people as potential friends rather than potential threats. That woman seemed like a character from a book she had read long ago, someone whose experiences were so different from her own that they might as well have belonged to a different species. The school teacher who had worried about lesson plans and student progress had been replaced by a predator who calculated wind speed and bullet trajectory, who measured success in terms of eliminated targets rather than educated minds. But as the eastern sky began to lighten with the approach of dawn, Maria felt a strange sense of completion, as if the circle that had begun with her grandmother's murder was finally about to be closed. The woman she had become was the weapon that the woman she had been could never have imagined, forged by loss and hardened by necessity into something capable of delivering the justice that no court could provide. She watched through her scope as the activity in the base below increased with the approaching sunrise. Soldiers moved into formation in the central courtyard, their weapons gleaming in the early light as they prepared for the ceremony that would celebrate their control over territory they had stolen through murder and terror. At exactly 6:17 a.m., as the sun cleared the eastern peaks and painted the valley in shades of gold and orange, the command center door opened and Colonel Mladic emerged into the courtyard. He was dressed in a crisp uniform decorated with medals that represented not acts of valor, but the systematic destruction of civilian populations. Maria controlled her breathing and made the final calculations that would determine whether her bullet found its intended target. Wind speed, atmospheric pressure, target movement, bullet drop over distance. All the variables that she had studied and practiced for hundreds of hours condensed into a single moment of absolute focus. Through her scope she could see the colonel's face clearly, weathered and hard, marked by the casual cruelty of a man who had ordered the deaths of thousands without a moment's hesitation. This was the face that had looked down at Nana Malika as she died, the mind that had planned the destruction of her village and the elimination of everyone who had made her life meaningful. The crosshairs settled on their target as the colonel paused at the exact spot where Maria had calculated he would be most vulnerable. For a fraction of a second, across the distance that separated the ridge from the valley, the eyes of the hunter met the eyes of the prey through the magnification of the rifle scope. The colonel never saw her, never knew that death was reaching across 2 kilometers of mountain air to find him. But in that instant before Maria squeezed the trigger, she whispered words that carried all the grief and rage and love of 3 years in the wilderness. For Nana. For everyone. For all of us who will never come home. The rifle bucked against her shoulder with the recoil of the most important shot she had ever fired. The bullet traveled for nearly 3 seconds across the valley that had once been her home, carrying with it all the weight of justice deferred and promises kept to the dead. When the bullet found its target, Colonel Mladic dropped instantly, killed by a shot that had been 3 years in the making. The soldiers in the courtyard spun in confusion, searching for a threat they could not identify, while their commander lay bleeding on the ground where he had planned to celebrate his victory over the innocent.
Maria did not wait to observe the chaos her shot had created.
She was already moving away from her firing position, beginning the journey that would take her down from the mountains and back toward whatever remained of the civilized world. The mission that had defined her life for 3 years was complete, and the woman who had become a ghost in the mountains could finally allow herself to remember what it meant to be human.
The shot at dawn had ended more than just the life of a war criminal. It had closed a chapter in Maria's own story, the dark chapter that had begun with her grandmother's murder and continued through years of hardship and violence in the wilderness. She had become the instrument of justice that her shattered world had required, but now she could begin the even more difficult task of learning to be Maria Kovac again. As she descended from the ridge where she had fired her final shot as the ghost, Maria felt the weight of her rifle on her shoulder and the lighter weight of her grandmother's recipe book in her pack. Both objects represented parts of who she had become, the destroyer and the keeper of memory, the predator and the granddaughter who still remembered the taste of Nana's bread. The woman who walked down from the mountains that morning carried all these contradictions within her, along with the knowledge that sometimes survival requires becoming someone you never wanted to be. She had paid a terrible price for justice, but she had ensured that some debts to the dead would never go unpaid. The war would eventually end, as all wars do, but Maria's war had ended with a single shot at sunrise, fired from a ridge where she had once picked flowers for a grandmother, who had taught her that some things in life were worth any sacrifice to protect. They burned everything she owned. At sunrise, the female sniper answered with 1 shot.